Welcome to the deep dive. This morning, we're tackling a conflict that's really been thrust back into the global spotlight.
Yeah, after that Hamas attack on Israel, October 8th. A
Yeah,
truly shocking event.
absolutely. Significant casualties, tragically, and it left, well, it left a lot of us with some really urgent questions.
You hear it everywhere. Who is Hamas? Why did this specific attack happen now?
And maybe the biggest question of all, what are the deep historical roots? What's really driving this incredibly complex, long-running conflict? So that's our mission today. We want to do a deep dive into those intricate historical origins, the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Right. The idea is to give you, the listener, a kind of essential background.
Exactly. A shortcut, maybe, to grasping why the claims to this land are so tangled up.
Understand the displacement, the history, the core issues.
Without feeling totally overwhelmed by, just the sheer amount of information out there.
Okay. So where do we start? To really get the present, you have to go way back.
Way back. Over 3,000 years, actually. Think around 1000 BCE.
We're talking about Jerusalem, a city with just immense history, layers upon layers.
Right. And around that time, 1000 BCE, Jerusalem is first declared a capital, a promised land.
This is after the Hebrews, the ancestors of the Jews, defeated the Philistines.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? The name Palestine actually traces back to those very Philistines.
It really does. That alone sort of hints at how intertwined and, frankly, contested this land has been from the absolute beginning.
So King David, the first Jewish king, makes that declaration. Jerusalem becomes this crucial, historical, spiritual center for the Jewish people.
But, and this is key, its importance doesn't stop there. Over the centuries, it becomes sacred to other major religions, too.
For Christians, obviously, the site of Jesus' crucifixion.
And for Islam, hugely significant. It's revered as the place where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven to meet God.
And also where Prophet Isa Jesus in the Quran ascended to heaven without crucifixion, according to Islamic belief.
Exactly. So you have this multi-religious reference. It means Jerusalem's emotional, its spiritual pull is just unavoidable.
It's not just about, specific holy sites either, is it?
No, it's deeper. It's about these profoundly held, sometimes conflicting stories of belonging, of prophecy.
Which makes any single claim to the city just incredibly potent, emotionally charged.
Absolutely fundamental to why the conflict persists. And then there's the geography.
Right. It's not just holy, it's strategic.
Hugely. A land bridge connecting Africa, Asia, Europe, plus it's fertile land.
And that combination, well, it's been a recipe for conflict, hasn't it?
A recipe for constant, dramatic conflict. The sources are stark on this.
Yeah, they mention Jerusalem alone.
Okay.
Destroyed at least twice.
Besieged 23 times.
Attacked 52 times.
Captured and recaptured 42 times.
Just staggering numbers by Babylonians, Romans, Byzantines, Ottomans. The list goes on.
So think about what that means for the people living there over centuries of this kind of upheaval.
Constant change, constant instability.
Displacement becomes a recurring theme. Jews facing persecution at various times often fled, many towards Europe.
While other groups moved in, Palestinians among them establishing their own deep roots.
Right. So you get this constant ebb and flow, creating these overlapping claims. It's not just a holy land anymore. It's a long-standing homeland for both peoples.
Each with their own, deeply felt history of being there and also of loss.
Which brings us closer to the modern era. Colonialism complicates things even further.
Okay, so World War I happens. The Ottoman Empire, which had controlled the region for centuries, loses.
And the area, known then as Palestine, becomes a British mandate. Britain is now in charge.
But Britain, well, they'd put themselves in a really difficult position, hadn't they?
An almost impossible one. They'd made conflicting promises, deeply conflicting.
On one hand, promising independence to Palestinians if they helped in the war effort against the Ottomans.
But on the other hand, the Balfour Declaration, simultaneously promising support for establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
Again, if Jewish groups helped Britain win.
It was a diplomatic tightrope that was basically guaranteed to snap.
And snap it did. After Britain won the war, you see this real escalation.
Significant Jewish immigration into Palestine increases, driven by Zionism, by the desire for that national home, but also by rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
Leading to friction, constant friction, and sometimes violence between the existing Palestinian residents and the new arrivals.
And then comes World War II, the Holocaust.
Which just drastically intensifies Jewish immigration, people desperately fleeing the genocide in Europe.
Exactly. Seeking refuge, This mass influx completely overwhelmed the British administration.
They couldn't manage the tensions, the violence.
So they basically handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations.
And the UN steps in. In 1947, they vote on a partition plan, Resolution 181.
The vote was 33-13, with 10 abstentions. It proposed dividing the land into two states, one Jewish, one Arab.
With Jerusalem, because of its unique status, intended to be under international UN administration, a corpus separatum.
But, critically, while the Jewish leadership accepted the plan, albeit with reservations, the Arab states and Palestinian leaders rejected it outright.
They saw it as fundamentally unfair, giving away land they considered theirs.
Setting the stage for immediate conflict.
And then, in May 1948, right as the British mandate ended, the Jewish leadership declared it, the State of Israel.
David Ben-Gurion becomes the first prime minister.
And this declaration, well, understandably, it infuriated the surrounding Arab nations.
They saw it as an illegitimate seizure of land. The Arab League formed, and almost immediately, war.
The First Arab-Israeli War, 1948.
Yeah. And the fallout from that war was immense, particularly for the Palestinians.
The sources talk about over 700,000 Palestinians displaced, becoming refugees.
Forced to flee to neighboring countries, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Egypt. This event is known to Palestinians as the Nakba, the catastrophe.
It fundamentally reshaped the region. Generations of refugees, a core issue that persists today.
And the war redrew the map again. Israel won, supported by the U.S. and others.
But two key territories ended up outside Israeli control initially.
Right. The Gaza Strip went under Egyptian military administration.
And the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, came under Jordanian control.
In these areas, Gaza and the West Bank became the main population centers for those displaced Palestinians and those who remained.
But those borders, established in 48-49, they didn't last either.
No. Tensions remained incredibly high. Cross-border raids, skirmishes. It simmered for years.
Until 1967, another major turning point.
Arab nations, led by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, mobilized forces. Israel launched a preemptive strike,
Leading to the Six-Day War.
and it was a swift, decisive Israeli victory. In just 6 days, Israel took control of Gaza from Egypt,
The West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan.
and the Golan Heights from Syria. Suddenly, all of Mandate Palestine, plus the Golan, was under Israeli control.
Which meant millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza were now living under Israeli military occupation, a situation that continues in various forms today.
Yeah. And with these territories now occupied, you see the rise of more organized Palestinian resistance.
The Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, it was actually formed a bit earlier, in 1964.
Right, under the auspices of the Arab League initially, but it became more independent, especially after '67. Yasser Arafat became its chairman in 1969.
Its main base, politically anyway, was often seen as the West Bank, though its leadership was frequently in exile.
And for, well, roughly 2 decades, the PLO and its various factions engaged in armed struggle. The sources mention sabotage, attacks, hijackings.
Aiming to disrupt Israeli control, raise international awareness, and push for Palestinian statehood.
But then, a major shift. In 1988,
What happened then?
the PLO under Arafat made a huge strategic change. They officially renounced terrorism.
And crucially, they recognized Israel's right to exist.
Yes, opting instead for peaceful negotiation.
Yeah.
They formed the Fatah political group, which remains dominant within the PLO, to pursue self-governance through diplomacy.
But not everyone agreed with that path.
Not at all. And that's where Hamas comes in. It was founded just before that shift, in 1987, during the first Intifada, the Palestinian uprising.
And their perspective was different.
Fundamentally different. Hamas disagreed strongly with the PLO's move towards negotiation and recognition of Israel.
They believed Palestinians were negotiating from a position of weakness.
Exactly. They advocated for continued armed resistance to liberate all of historic Palestine. And their main base of operations became the Gaza Strip. Their ideology also has strong Islamist roots, unlike the more secular PLO.
It's also worth mentioning Hezbollah here, right?
Definitely. Formed in Lebanon back in 1982, primarily to fight the Israeli invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon.
And they were successful in pushing Israeli forces out by 2000, actually. Not 1985. They fully withdrew later.
Right. The withdrawal completed in 2000. And today, Hezbollah is a major political and military force within Lebanon. Very powerful.
With significant armed forces. And the sources do note their support for the recent Hamas attack. They are allies, both backed by Iran.
Yes, that backing from Iran is a key factor for both groups.
So, okay, even with Hamas emerging, the PLO under Fatah pursued the diplomatic track.
And they achieved what seemed like a massive breakthrough in 1993.
The Oslo Accords, signed on the White House lawn. Iconic images.
Truly monumental, it seemed at the time. It involved mutual recognition.
Palestine, represented by the PLO, recognized Israel's statehood.
And Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people.
And the Accords set up the Palestinian Authority, granting it limited self-rule, administrative control over parts of the West Bank and Gaza.
Yes, areas A, B, and C with varying degrees of control. The ultimate goal, stated in the Accords, was a permanent settlement based on UN Resolutions 242 and 338.
Which implied the creation of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, often envisioned with East Jerusalem as its capital.
That was the hope. That was the framework, the two-state solution framework.
But here's the kicker, isn't it? It's been 30 years since Oslo.
Over 30 years now, and those core objectives, well, they haven't been achieved.
The final status issues, borders, settlements, refugees, Jerusalem, were never resolved.
No permanent peace deal was ever reached. The promise of a viable, independent Palestinian state, with East Jerusalem as its capital, it remains just that, a promise, unfulfilled.
Which leads us to the current landscape, which feels maybe more complex than ever.
It certainly does, partly because the regional dynamics have shifted so much.
Those Arab nations, once seen as unanimous, staunch supporters of the Palestinian cause,
are now much more divided, or at least pursuing their own national interests more openly. Their positions are more, let's say, neutral or pragmatic in some cases.
Egypt, for example, made peace with Israel way back in the late 70s after the Camp David Accord.
Right, and now often acts as a mediator between Israel and Palestinian factions, especially Hamas and Gaza.
And then there's the really big shift, Saudi Arabia.
Historically a heavyweight supporter of the Palestinians, but recently growing much closer to the U.S., Israel's key ally.
And there was serious talk, plans mentioned in the sources, for Saudi Arabia to formally normalize relations with Israel, maybe in 2024, before the October 7th attack anyway.
These shifts, often called the Abraham Accords for other Gulf nations, are driven by things like shared concerns about Iran, economic opportunities.
But the consequence is that Palestinians can feel increasingly isolated, like their traditional allies are moving on.
Yeah, and while all this diplomacy and shifting alliances happen at the state level,
the reality on the ground for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, according to the sources, keeps getting worse.
That's a consistent theme. Persistent grievances, lack of infrastructure, especially in Gaza.
Movement restrictions, checkpoints in the West Bank, economic hardship.
Ongoing Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank, which is illegal under international law, eating away at land intended for a future Palestinian state.
Displacement from homes, particularly in East Jerusalem.
And perceived encroachments on religious sites, like the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, which is incredibly sensitive.
All of this fuels ongoing discontent, frustration, anger.
These worsening conditions, combined with the failure of the peace process, the unfulfilled promises, it creates this pressure cooker.
Which inevitably leads to clashes, protests, violence, intermittent conflict, right up to the events of today.
Exactly.
So when we deep dive like this, what really comes through is just how incredibly layered this whole conflict is.
It's not just about recent events. It's centuries of history, religion, geopolitics.
Competing narratives, competing claims to the same small piece of land.
A legacy of displacement, of war, of failed agreements, felt deeply by both sides.
It stretches back millennia, really.
So maybe the question to leave our listeners with is this.
Given all of that, given this incredibly long, tangled history, the intertwined claims, the shifting powers, the broken promises.
What does it actually take? What conditions would be needed for a lasting peace to finally take root?
In a land that holds such profound significance, such deep meaning for so many different people.
How do you even begin to resolve historical grievances that are passed down generation after generation?
When people's narratives of who belongs, of justice and injustice are so deeply felt, so fundamentally opposed sometimes.
And when the land itself seems to tell conflictless stories depending on who you ask.
It's definitely something to reflect on, something that goes far beyond the daily headlines.